Just a quick heads up, this video is a sequel. Last month we explored a timeline where, by some tweaks to the colonial administration and the independence war, Mexico was able to stave off the worst of American expansionism and attract a number of immigrants needed to become a prosperous democracy similar to the US. From there, it would face conflict with France over the state of Venezuela, face down the US in a proper victory, and eventually ally with the Germans in World War I, and again face the US in a battle for supremacy that lasted nearly as long as the original World War. By the end, even these American giants were exhausted, resulting in the US suing for peace. In the resulting negotiations, the U.S. saw its Caribbean presence gutted, the loss of Louisiana and Arkansas, the establishment of sister republics in Cuba and Hispanola, and military restrictions. Germany clings to its gains in Eastern Europe with desperation, while Britain has absconded with what it could. Japan, without the Americans to open them up, was carved into spheres of influence and occupation by European powers. However, despite these gains, Mexico is just as exhausted and unstable as the rest of the great powers. To learn more about this timeline, check out part 1 in the upper right, but for now, let's get right into the show. Last we left Mexico, they had just signed the pivotal Treaty of Mobile with the US, ending the Great War. The US lost a large amount of territory, including the state of Louisiana and its Caribbean holding. However, despite extracting economic concessions from the defeated Americans, an indemnity at minimum, and likely some trade concessions, the Mexican economy will likely be seriously struggling as well during the era. Unlike the US in our timeline, neither American superpower was able to just sit there and sell to their Europeans of choice. They mobilized the largest armies and navies of the war, and spent nearly 4 years fighting under those conditions. As a result, not only do they need to rebuild large amounts of their own economy, their relative prosperity during the early war was much shorter. As a result, the economic situation in the 1920s is far from roaring by any reasonable metric. While it will still be a time of political change and modernism, it will be much less transformative. It's harder to have mass cultural revolutions and modernizations when you're worried about your job and food, as I'm sure we're all aware of at this point. However, Mexico is still doing a lot better than in our timeline. In our world, the period from 1910 to 1920 was the Mexican Revolution, wherein the country spent about a decade in a cycle of governments and civil wars, culminating in the current Republican government after 10 years of chaos. Now, this book, The Eagle and the Virgin, claims that only about a third of the Mexican population was literate, 33% of men and 27% of women. Mexico had about 15 million people in 1910, meaning that only about 5 million were considered proficient. And obviously, even by that point, it had gone through a number of governments, republics, dictatorships, foreign imposed empires, you name it. However, here, it's hard to give any meaningful numbers. The entire conceit of the timeline is that the Jesuits established a stronger foundation for literacy in the country, and a few better decisions early on allowed them to attract more immigrants from Catholic Europe. Just going by the real-life population and the Mexican cession would get us to about 22.7 million people. Adding in Honduras, who is the only part of Central America I could find numbers for before the 50s, gets us to 23.28 million. In contrast, the Union would still have 84 million if we just moved the southwestern border. But here's the problem with that. By having Mexico retain the Mexican cession, we dramatically change settlement patterns. The US will attract less immigrants because it can't literally give that land away, while Mexico would be in a position to do so. And prosperity also attracts immigrants, not just land. So the numbers are more or less made up at this point, given that we're over a century out from independence. So I'm more or less setting Mexico and the US at respectively 65 million and 73 in 1910. A massive hike for Mexico, obviously, but not as big a fall for the US as you would think, since they still took over Cuba and Hispanola, and now Mexico will have a much higher literacy rate, somewhere in the 70s to 80s range. Again, I had to play with a lot of numbers in that last part. However, here's the thing, we're not talking about this time on Mexico in 1910, we're talking about it in 1920, after it won the Great War. Strictly speaking, I had the end of the conflict in 1919, but whatever. While Mexico is exhausted by the Great War and has to rebuild its northern border, which are utterly massive, it still has plenty of land and will likely see a small jump in population as people move in from its young client states in the Caribbean or even from Europe. I would probably expect a lot of French people to show up in Texas and California, which would have any number of consequences. As a result, shortly after the war, the numbers probably look more like 68 million to 74. It's not even that the US stagnated, it's that the population would shrink due to losing states like Louisiana and Cuba. Plus, there would likely be an exodus of black Americans to New Africa or whatever the area is called. It's an artificial buffer state between the US and Mexico, but it's an artificial buffer state without segregation and protected by Mexico, which is still an upgrade to living in the deep south of this timeline. I actually made a pretty serious error on the whole concept, but we'll get to that in a moment. Now, admittedly, I gave Mexico a pretty basic political system in the last video. A parliamentary republic or constitutional monarchy, its largest parties were the conservatives and the liberals. However, unlike in our timeline where the liberals won and were the stronger faction, in this scenario I gave the edge to the conservatives, which led to a more centralized state compared to liberal federalism, a greater role for the church, etc. I would naturally assume that they would also be the party of foreign tariffs, but I'm not necessarily sure. Mexico also began to dabble with corporatism in the 1840s of our timeline, but because of the earlier butterflies, I felt like it would be odd to assume that that happens here. However, we'll come back to that theory in a moment. The other major political party would be the more secular liberals, who were also in favor of federalism. In fact, Mexico still allowed for internal tariffs pretty late, so they may favor that instead of federal one. And of course, nativism would become a serious question given the sheer amount of immigrants that the republic would receive, but it's hard to assume which party adopts that nativist position. However, come the 1920s, I think that this party system would begin to break down. While organized labor would not be a new thing at this point, most of the New World saw the notion emerge in the mid-19th century, I think that would explode in the interwar period. After all, the people who fought and died and sacrificed everything for their country would be expected to come home and what? Struggle to find employment? Get treated like shit by old codgers when they did find work? The economy would likely enter a recession as the government stopped ordering massive amounts of guns and food, meaning layoffs and other economic woes. Now, it wouldn't be a Great Depression, but like I said at the top, the Roaring Twenties aren't really a thing here. In addition, this labor movement will absolutely attract the women's rights groups in Mexico. It's a pretty well-known fact that on the American home front during both wars, women often entered manufacturing jobs while the men were overseas, though this is more so a World War II phenomenon. Here, that's going to apply to both the US and Mexico. Women will be relatively liberated in the interwar period and find common cause with pro-worker organizations as a direct result, pushing back against conservative and clerical aims to undo the progress. Now, you know how I mentioned corporatism? Well, the idea is that the economic classes, the workers, the middle class, and the rich, should more or less work together. Now, I don't think that's going to draw a lot of support in this timeline, but I think that it could indicate what a workers' party would look like in Mexico. Namely, some level of syndicalism, because apparently this timeline is a Kaiserreich submod. Syndicalism is the idea that workers' unions should control the state, and eventually the state should wither on the vine, so to speak. That last element is a pretty common theory to most forms of Marxism. Regardless, throughout the 1920s, various worker unions would be actively sending men to Congress, outcompeting the conservative and especially the liberal establishment. However, being a new faction, they would be incredibly prone to division and lack a cohesive identity politically, which would lead to the conservatives winning big throughout the 1920s, which will embolden the calls for change and the growing frustration with the status quo. Now let's move on to the international scene. America in this timeline is flat broke. Its own economy will be facing the same woes as the Mexican one, but without California gold, the dollar will be weaker and more prone to inflation on the gold standard. In addition, it has to pay up to the Central Powers, mostly Mexico of course, but still quite detrimental. I would expect a great deal of anger and instability in the Deep South and Midwest, people saying that it wasn't their war and they fought and died for nothing. The Union was torn apart by the conflict and they're all paying for it. Needless to say, if we assume the Union intervened in 1917 and the war ended in 1919, then whatever party won those terms will not be doing very well come 1920 or 1924. In fact, I would expect a series of one-term presidencies and a very divided Congress. Tariffs on European goods would only make it worse at this point, and the Union is the second or third largest economy on the planet, so there's no one to give them credit like they were able to do with Germany. And then there's the immigrant problem. The Deep South could very well undergo a pretty serious demographic shift. Places like Alabama and Mississippi would see a large amount of their African American populations leave for New Africa, which would see its own white population in exodus. In addition, the various Caribbean states would likely be unstable, and many of them would have mixed Anglo-Latino communities or even just American settlers that attempt to move to the states. This will further impact the difficulties of getting a job in the post-war South, and people will be angry. The Union will be in prime position for a stab in the back myth or two. The black population collaborated with the Mexicans to get their own artificial state, while the Latinos are coming from across the sea to take over the South. Never mind that the Latinos in question were American citizens, the anger in American politics at this point would be the driving factor. Now, I'm not saying the US goes fully fascistic. It would take a lot of momentum to break up the partisan establishment, and any third party would need concentrated effort on the state level. That being said, I would fully expect a rightward turn socially and calls for massive reform throughout the entire 1920s. This would embolden Dixiecrats and their allies throughout the South, and even the Republicans would have to dabble in that kind of populism to stay competitive in the Upper South and Midwest. I'm not sure if the US would necessarily want to reconquer the entire Caribbean due to the demographic shifts, but Cuba and Louisiana would absolutely be in the crosshairs of the new movement. Regardless, if American revanchism comes primarily from the right, it would likely have to infiltrate one of the main political parties, and while they wouldn't necessarily be undemocratic, I'd expect you to see a tightening of the leash on minority groups, immigrants, etc. There's also the chance the US goes left. This would be more sudden, in the chaos of the very early 20s. After all, the Socialist Party already existed and did have some history of state-level progress. This would easily become their chance to be the new second party, given that time and organizational advantage. This version of the US would probably be just as unstable, all things considered. There would absolutely be a lot of socialist agitators emboldened by the rise of the party, resulting in violent reprisals. I wouldn't bet on a socialist president until 1928, since they'd spend 1924 fighting for the role of opposition, though they might be able to force the election to Congress, where, because the outgoing Congress still controls the contingent at this point, the SPUSA gets utterly laughed out of the room. Now, the socialists in the US would be a bit more dogmatic than their rightist counterparts, and likely pursue a greater deal of partisan cohesion, giving them a governing advantage that allows their reforms to take hold. They wouldn't really tighten the leash on a minority basis. If anything, they'd attempt to squeeze out the Dixiecrats and would aim for consolidation of workers' unions if they try for an authoritarian form of socialism, but it's hard to say. Regardless of how they get there, both American paths would want to reverse the Treaty of Mobile. There's a difference between losing land they'd only had for 20 years, that had been part of Mexico and was highly mixed as a direct result, and the carving out of several client states, some of which had been American longer than Mexico had been a country, and causing demographic chaos in the entire South. Not to mention, while Mexico champions its black client state in Louisiana as an exercise in self-determination and the rights of the oppressed, everyone would see through that. To Mexico and its allies, it would be a buffer state, an American Belgium meant to delay the US advance by a few weeks and force them into a smaller and more fortified front. And to the Americans, it would be a forward base, a Mexican puppet state that allows their soldiers to have better positioning to invade Alabama and Arkansas. In truth, it's both of these. I could see Mexico being divided militarily. A defensive plan makes sense when dealing with a long front against an enemy that does still outnumber you, while the more aggressive strategy appeals to those who want to make use of the Mexican Navy to squeeze the US and prevent Texas, a major agricultural sector, from falling into enemy hands. The Caribbean is also going to be a serious problem. Nationalistically, it'll be for the same reason as Louisiana/New Africa, but it presents a very different question militarily. After all, Cuba is likely filled with white settlers, which means it will be similar to the loss of the Polish corridor or even the Sudetenland. And while Hispaniola will likely be seen as more of a land for freedmen and have a very small white population, it's still a major point of American naval logistics that they need to control it. Without these islands, the effective area Mexico needs to blockade the Americans in is going to be seriously reduced. While the US is an export economy and likely doesn't need to import that much in terms of war material, it not being able to export will cause economic problems even during a war. The US got rich selling to Britain even after 1941, after all. Not to mention, if Mexico controls Cuba, they flanked the US and can bomb into Alabama all the way to southern Georgia. Aerial combat was in its infancy at this point in time, but it doesn't take a genius to realize the threat of that. Sorry for the very quick interruption, but if you're enjoying the video so far, please consider a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and lets you stay updated about future releases. Thank you. Now, before we move on to Europe, I want to touch on the Mexican client states, Louisiana/New Africa, Cuba, and Hispaniola. Now, I actually fucked up last time. Because the end of World War I wasn't the focus in that video, I assumed that Louisiana was still majority black, which is why I had Mexico use it as a base for New Africa. As it turns out, it wasn't in the slightest. By 1910, it was only about 19% black. I fucked up with the Great Migration, and that made the entire concept very unlikely. That being said, I could still see it being a very fucked up plan to permanently weaken the US and their claim to the state, but it would require total occupation of Louisiana and part of the Deep South. In Our World's 1920, Louisiana had about 1.7 million people, of which around 323,000 would be black. In this world, after the creation of an explicitly black state causes the exodus of the white majority and the immigration of the black minority elsewhere, I think that New Africa would be about 1 million. Firstly, different settlement patterns mess with the state prior to this point, and secondly, we are getting rid of the vast majority of the population and replacing it with a group that numbers about a fifth of the host country. So, yeah. 1919 to 1925 would more or less be demographic collapse in this country. That likely leaves it susceptible to both Mexican economic exploitation and a strongman government. Cuba and Hispaniola would be more stable, if only because they're not meant to be the ethnostate of a minority group. While there would still be a lot of white people and Latinos immigrating to the continental US due to seeing themselves as American, I don't think it would be as extreme with Louisiana. And as a result, they'd be able to transfer into independent but pro-Mexican democracies. Cuba historically had been a peer to a pre-split Virginia, so I'm going to apply that trend as well since it's been American for a while, so it's probably around 3.7 million people, maybe 3.5. In contrast, Hispaniola would be around 2 million and dominated by the Haitian population, which was significantly larger than the Dominicans at the time. I won't really comment on the domestic politics of any of these countries because that would be an outgrowth of their politics as American states, which we don't really know. However, I do think there would be a sizable white population in both that want to become American states again. So meet the American Party of Cuba, an ideological offshoot of the Democrats. Pro-US, pro-free trade, racism may vary. Now, before we get to the war between these two assholes, let's talk about Europe. Because the war lasted another several months and the Americans weren't able to actually make it over to the continent, things ended very differently. First and foremost, while Germany was able to take what it wanted from France, it has not won the peace. It wasn't able to touch Britain, and those extra months only applied more financial problems and chaos to Germany, to the point where I speculated on a potential revolution. While that may or may not happen immediately, they will be gripped by instability for years, making it difficult for them to exploit Eastern Europe. As a result, the client states of Ukraine and Belarus would wind up breaking away, while Poland would remain loyal. Britain would likely be more or less untouched by the Peace of Mobile. As a result, I think that by the late 1920s to 1930s, the Russians, under whoever, could threaten Eastern Europe again, which might drag Germany in. For the sake of a timeline, we'll assume that Russia has successfully restored their control over Livonia and Ukraine, but that Belarus and Lithuania have re-established ties to Germany. If France is somehow to be involved in the war, they'll need to make it a defensive strategy and desperately need the support of Britain, because they lack the resources to actually be a challenge to Germany unless they get their coal and iron from the Americas or the British Empire. Realistically, Britain would be in support of this entirely so that Germany can't recover fully and assert its hegemony over Europe and challenge the empire. But I need to make it clear that the only reason they have a chance in hell is that the majority of Germany's attention is on the east to reestablish control over the region when the dust settles. Now, as for tying this into the American war, it's difficult. However, I could see Britain, and especially Canada, wary of American nationalism, viewing the new government as a threat and working with Mexico in order to contain their expansionism. Thus, war breaks out around the mid-1930s, with France, Britain, Mexico, and Russia on one side, and the US, Germany, and their client states on the other, after Russia launches an invasion of Belarus/White Ruthenia. Frankly, Germany does not need to bother with France. This is a Russo-German war, and offensives into France will only distract from that goal. However, Russia is the one on the offensive here, which is both good and bad for them. It's good because that means Germany won't be at the gates of Moscow early into the conflict, which allows Russia to play the long game, especially with the Royal Navy supporting them. However, it also means that Russian logistics will be under serious strain, and their offensives will be propped up by British and Mexican resources. It's also worth noting that in this timeline, Japan wound up de facto split between the great powers, and this went to Britain for the most part. As a result, the West can bring its full maritime might to bear and increase the pressure Germany is under. The American war likely starts under similar circumstances to the Europeans, though maybe the US isn't able to reconquer any territory prior, since Mexico has a lot less room to give. Regardless, American tanks roll into Mexico and Canada at the same time the Russians are fighting in Minsk and Poland. I don't know if they'd converge on the Blitzkrieg, especially with the sizes of the fronts, but I can definitely see the US pushing for a very fast campaign in Texas and Louisiana. The war would be utter hell. If Texas falls, then Mexico's food supply will suffer immensely. It would probably still be the best of the Allied coalition because California exists, but this would also give the US a hell of a lot of oil, which also means that the Mexican Navy lacks a lot of its oil. If Texas doesn't fall, then the two powers enter into trench warfare again, which means that the Americans are on a timer and need to break Mexico quickly. And of course, this ties up the industries of both sides, which will have consequences for the British presence in Canada. Frankly, it's a disaster for Britain no matter what, because it means that the Mexican Navy can't protect the sea lanes on the western side of the Atlantic. This means that Britain needs to pull back its blockade of Germany to ensure that everything gets to London safely. Add in that France likely isn't putting much squeeze on Germany other than diversion, and Texas probably matters more to the European theater than almost any battle in Belarus itself. However, as always, Mexico is the protagonist. As a result, despite the losses in Texas, they are self-contained, and over the next year and a half, Mexico manages to push the US out of the region and launch counteroffensives. From there, the Canadians, assuming they've held out and are being reinforced by other parts of the empire, would likely begin their own offensives into New England and the Midwest. If successful, this would cripple the US. If not successful, then it would force them to pull back from the Mexican front. As a result, I would give the US another 2 years from this point, but I'm not entirely sure. Frankly, even figuring out what to do with a defeated America in this context would be a nightmare. There's only so many ways to artificially lob land off the place despite how massive it is. Germany, on the other hand, well, with the early fighting in North America and what happens to Texas, I think that Germany is able to contain the Russians, which will allow them to crush France once and for all. Frankly, there's no more territory Germany can justify taking other than a rump Breton republic, so in all likelihood, it's a very light piece in that respect. But you can imagine that Germany takes everything that isn't nailed down back to Berlin, and some stuff that was. From there, they work on taking back Eastern Europe, and in a reversal of our timeline, use what scraps they've gotten from France to push to the Brest-Litovsk line of our timeline. Russia might not fold immediately, but they probably can't afford to wage the war past this point anyway without Stalin, and whoever is in charge would likely be facing too much unrest to continue the war. The end of World War II leaves no one happy, but also leaves no room for a third conflict. The Germans feel they can't trust anyone, there are no pure allies in Europe, only the ever-adversarial British and the vanquished remains of the French and Russians. The US's fate is uncertain, but its days as a rival to Mexico and Britain are certainly over. However, London has no room to talk, having likely spent the last of its imperial wealth and lacking the means to reassert control. Mexico emerges battered but not broken or beaten, now the undisputed superpower of the world, but the question of if they can hold it remains unknown. Before we go, I just want to say thank you to channel members Daikami, Jadeep Gill, Imagination, Nafumato, Grimwalt, and Dubs Main. And another special thank you to Grimswalt and Dubs Main for joining at the exclamation point level. Thank you so much for watching, and join me next time as we explore another alternate world.